Hey guys, tonight we dive headfirst into a world where biceps aren't just for flexing on Instagram. They're the ticket to respect, survival, and maybe a few bruised egos. Picture this, you're standing on a windswept Viking shore. The cold North Sea breeze messing up your hair, or what's left of it, while burly warriors heft giant stones like they're lifting feathers. You probably won't survive this unless you're ready to match that raw Nordic grit and maybe question your own gym routine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments. Because strength contests in Viking times were basically the original Global Fitness Challenge, minus the protein shakes and gym selfies. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think Vikings spent all their time pillaging and sailing longships, but let me tell you, these guys took their strength seriously, like legendary seriously. Strength wasn't just about swinging axes or wrestling sea monsters, okay? Maybe not actual sea monsters, but probably some angry fishermen. It was woven into their daily lives and social fabric. These weren't just warriors, they were the original strongmen, and their weightlifting showdowns, well, let's say they made today's CrossFitters look like amateurs who skipped leg day. Now, when you imagine Viking strength contests, you might picture burly men in fur cloaks wrestling or arm wrestling by the fire, but the real story is both more fascinating and funnier than that. The Vikings had a tradition of lifting ridiculously heavy stones, some so massive they'd make your gym's kettlebells blush. These stones weren't just workout props, they were tests of manhood, markers of status, and sometimes sources of outright hilarity. In fact, the very idea of lifting weights for Vikings was an unpolished, rugged affair. No shiny dumbbells or adjustable plates here. They used whatever was at hand, boulders, logs, chunks of iron, whatever could crush your fingers if you weren't careful. Imagine trying to deadlift a rock the size of a small car while your mates heckle you or bet you'll drop it on your foot. Talk about a motivation boost. Historians still argue whether these stone lifting contests were purely practical strength tests or if they also served as theatrical displays of bravado. Some suggest these events had religious or ritualistic undertones, where showing physical might pleased the gods or channeled ancestral spirits. But let's be honest, a lot of it probably came down to one thing: who could look the most badass in front of the village, and maybe impress a certain Viking maiden. The origins of these strength contests likely trace back to the daily demands of Viking life. Dragging heavy logs for shipbuilding, hauling massive nets from the sea, or moving massive stones for building fortifications required serious muscle over time. These tasks morphed into competitive challenges, a way for men to prove their worth beyond the battlefield, and you can bet the loser of these contests wasn't just nursing bruised pride, but probably a bruised ego, severe enough to last through winter. But strength alone wasn't the whole story. Vikings blended competition with humour, storytelling, and sometimes sheer silliness. Records and sagas mention feats that sound like a mix between Olympic lifting and slapstick comedy. Picture a Viking trying to lift a stone, only for it to slip and send him sprawling, with his crew erupting in laughter, because yes, Vikings could be tough, but they also knew how to poke fun at themselves. This blend of grit and humour shaped Viking culture in ways that historians are still piecing together. For example, some sagas describe mock kings crowned during festivals for their drinking or lifting prowess, a role that came with temporary power to order hilarious tasks like telling everyone to drink with their left hand or sing songs about failed raids. These rituals weren't just fun, they reinforced social bonds and gave even the lowliest Viking a moment in the spotlight. And speaking of spotlight, you might be wondering, How did Vikings train for these weightlifting bouts? Spoiler alert, there was no train like a Viking Instagram account. Training was woven into daily life. Hauling wood, wrestling, farming, and yes, actual lifting of heavy objects kept their muscles in constant work mode. The harsh Nordic environment was nature's gym, and these warriors had no excuses about skipping leg day. Interestingly, Viking diet also played a role. Their food was rich in protein from fish, meat, and dairy, along with hearty grains. They probably didn't count macros, but their robust diet supported their physical feats. Some fringe historians speculate about the use of herbal concoctions or magic potions to boost strength, but that might be Viking storytelling embellishment or the earliest version of pre-workout supplements. By now, you're probably picturing a rugged, sweaty competition full of epic grunts and even more epic fails, and you'd be right, but beneath the spectacle was a culture that revered strength, not just as muscle power, but as a social currency, a way to earn respect, form alliances, and navigate the complex hierarchies of Viking society, from the cold shores of Scandinavia to the saga halls where tales of these contests echoed. Viking weightlifting showdowns were more than muscle games. They were a way of life, and as we move forward, you'll see how these contests evolved from simple strength tests to intricate social rituals filled with honour, humour, and astonishing human feats. So, ready to heft some legendary stones? Because next, we're diving into the very boulders that built Viking legends, some so heavy. You'll wonder if they ever had a chiropractor on call. You think lifting a kettlebell at your local gym is impressive? Well, Vikings had something a bit more hardcore: giant lifting stones that would make your dumbbell rack look like a toy collection. These weren't just random rocks they found lying around. They were specific stones used in challenges that tested strength, endurance, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. Picture this: you're a Viking, standing before a massive, roughly hewn boulder, a lump of raw granite or basalt, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds. You don't have fancy grips or gloves, just your bare hands, calloused and tough from a lifetime of hauling nets and chopping wood. Your task: lift that rock off the ground, and maybe carry it a few steps. Or better yet, hoist it onto a ledge high enough to prove your mettle. These lifting stones weren't just training tools, they were status symbols, almost like ancient badges of honour. Successfully moving or raising one could earn you a reputation that lasted for years, a ticket to the upper echelons of your clan. It was the Viking equivalent of I bench press twice my weight, but way more visceral. Some stones were even named, gaining legendary status in local folklore. And, believe it or not, some of these stones have survived the centuries, still sitting where Vikings once hoisted them, silent witnesses to feats of human strength. One particularly famous example is the Husafell stone, which weighs about 186 kilograms, around 410 pounds. It's been lifted by modern strongmen and powerlifters as a tribute to Viking tradition. Imagine trying to lift that thing without a modern gym, safety gear, or even a decent mattress to sleep on afterward. You'd probably want to keep a spare chiropractor on speed dial. And speaking of sore backs, lifting stones weren't just about brute strength. They demanded technique, balance, and determination. Now, the use of these stones is sometimes portrayed in sagas and local stories with a splash of dramatic flair, because Vikings did love a good tale. Some stories claim that only the strongest men could lift the stones, while others say lifting them was a rite of passage into adulthood. However, historians still argue whether these stones were primarily practical strength tests, ritual objects, or a bit of both. Some scholars suggest that lifting stones may have had ceremonial importance, possibly linked to religious rituals honouring the gods or ancestors. Others think they were purely social contests to show off physical prowess. Beyond the heavy lifting, there's an odd and humorous aspect to these contests. For instance, some accounts mention how Viking spectators would heckle lifters with witty insults or exaggerated predictions about who would topple first. Imagine a grizzled Viking yelling, "You'll drop that rock faster than Thor drops his hammer," while the lifter grunts and tries not to fall on his face. It's the kind of theatricality that turns a test of raw power into a full-blown communal event, complete with cheers, bets, and perhaps the odd prank involving a misplaced rock or two. Another quirky tidbit about these stones is how their sheer weight sometimes turned lifting competitions into accidental comedy. One saga describes a challenger who tried to lift a stone so heavy that it slipped out of his hands mid-lift, sending him tumbling backwards into a pile of hay, much to the delight of the watching crowd. The mix of awe and amusement seems to have been a big part of the Viking sporting culture. They celebrated strength, yeah, but also the very human side of failure and resilience. And here's a fascinating detail in some Viking communities. These stones were used to determine social roles beyond mere bragging rights. The ability to lift a particular stone could qualify a man for certain responsibilities, like serving in the king's guard or taking part in communal labour. It's not just about muscles, it's about trust and proving you can handle the demands of Viking society. Whether that's hauling supplies or defending the clan in battle, of course there's still debate among historians about just how common these lifting stones were and how widespread the practice was. Archaeological evidence is spotty, and much of what we know comes from sagas written centuries later, mixing fact with myth. Some argue that the romantic image of the Viking strongman has been exaggerated by later storytelling, while others believe these contests were genuinely central to Viking identity. What we can be sure of is that these stones were no joke. The sheer physical challenge they posed is a reminder that Viking life demanded more than just bravery, it required hard-earned strength. And since they lacked modern workout gear or sports science, their training was as much a part of everyday survival as it was competition. Think hauling timber for a long ship, moving stones for fortifications, or wrestling fellow warriors, all of it built the kind of muscle you don't get from scrolling through Instagram workout videos. Speaking of Instagram, it's fun to imagine how Vikings might have documented their stone lifting feats. If they had smartphones, would they have posted videos captioned "just moved a small boulder, no big deal Viking strong"? Or maybe pictures of bruised knuckles with the hashtag #StoneColdLifter instead. Their stories were passed down around firelight, embellished with humour, exaggeration, and plenty of Viking bravado. These lifting stones also had an unexpected community role. They were gathering points where people came to watch, talk, and bond over displays of strength. More than just a sport, these contests were social events that brought people together, combining competition with camaraderie. So next time you're at the gym grunting alone in front of a mirror, remember Vikings were hauling literal mountains and making it a community spectacle centuries before CrossFit had its moment. As we move from these ancient stones to the lively games and contests that surrounded them, you'll see how Vikings transformed raw power into a full cultural experience, one filled with laughter, rivalry, and the kind of showmanship that would put modern reality TV to shame. You've just marvelled at the Viking lifting stones, those massive, unwieldy boulders that tested sheer brute strength. But Viking strength contests weren't limited to just lifting heavy objects in grim silence. No, they had a whole circus of games and competitions where power met skill, strategy, and, frankly, a lot of good-natured chaos. These contests were the medieval equivalent of your local county fair meets Ironman competition, complete with grunts, cheers, and the occasional spilled mead in Viking society. These strongman challenges were more than just entertainment. They were vital social glue. People didn't have Netflix or TikTok to kill boredom. So a good game involving strength and skill was the highlight of the season. The contests ranged from stone lifting, which we covered, to wrestling, spear throwing, hammer tossing, and even some surprisingly sophisticated feats that required balance and coordination. Not just raw power. One popular event was Cub, often described as Viking lawn bowling, but that's selling it short. It required throwing wooden batons to knock down blocks, demanding precision and strength. While Cub was a crowd pleaser, the real star was the hammer tosser test of not only how far you could throw a heavy weapon, but also how accurately you could land it. Imagine channeling your inner Thor, hurling a hammer across the field, trying not to accidentally decapitate a spectator or your drinking buddy. Thankfully, no modern OSHA regulations were in place back then. Historians still argue whether some of these contests were purely recreational or had ritualistic or martial training purposes. For example, spear throwing could have been a practical skill sharpened under the guise of competition. Likewise, wrestling bouts tested combat readiness, but also offered a platform for young warriors to gain honour and recognition without drawing blood or starting feuds. The social significance of these games was huge. Winning a contest could elevate your status in the community, sometimes even influencing political power within the clan. And it wasn't just about men showing off. Entire villages gathered to watch, bet, and cheer, making these games a communal festival. It was a rare opportunity for everyone, from peasants to nobles, to mingle and engage in friendly rivalry. Now, here comes the hilarious part. The Vikings, despite their reputation as fierce warriors, had a penchant for turning their contests into full-blown spectacles of humour and mischief. There are accounts of games where the rules were as fluid as the mead supply, and where tricks, taunts, and outright pranks were as common as muscle flexing. One tale describes a competitor who tried to cheat by weighting his hammer with hidden stones, only to be caught mid-throw when his weapon veered wildly off course and smashed a merchant's cart. The resulting brawl apparently became the highlight of the day. Also, remember that Viking contests were often accompanied by a lot of drinking small beer for the kids and full-strength ale for the grown warriors. So, as the games wore on, coordination and judgment sometimes got a little fuzzy, turning serious competitions into slapstick comedy routines. You can almost hear the crowd's laughter as a burly Viking attempts a perfect toss, only to trip on a stray goat or his own beard and face-plant spectacularly. Speaking of beards, these contests often had informal king of the table ceremonies, where the winner earned the right to command the drinking games for the night, assigning silly dares and challenges. It was a role that mixed honour with absolute power to embarrass your friends, like ordering them to sing bawdy songs or perform ridiculous feats. This temporary throne was a comedic precursor to modern party crowns, minus the plastic and glitter, of course. One quirky event involved a balance challenge called Cross the River, where participants had to walk a narrow plank over a pool of water while carrying a full cup of ale. The stakes, spilling your drink, meant drinking more as a penalty, and a guaranteed splashdown into icy water if you missed a step. This game tested steadiness, focus, and your ability to laugh at failure, because falling in front of the whole village was pretty much guaranteed at some point. Women also participated in these games more than you might expect, not just as spectators, but as active competitors in certain contests, particularly in wrestling and feats of endurance. Their involvement challenges the stereotype of Viking women sitting passively in the background. In fact, some sagas describe women performing strength challenges to demonstrate their worthiness in marriage or leadership roles. Viking women weren't just shield maidens in myth. Many had real physical prowess, recognised by their communities. Interestingly, the preparation for these contests blended practical training with elements of storytelling and camaraderie. Warriors and villagers often gathered in longhouses, sharing tales of past victories, failures, and legendary feats, each story more exaggerated than the last. These narratives reinforced social bonds and motivated participants to push their limits. Remember that story about the lifting stone that slipped and sent a Viking sprawling? Tales like that weren't told to shame, but to celebrate human resilience and humour. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some historians speculate that Viking contests also served as early forms of dispute resolution. Instead of fights breaking out, rival clans or individuals might have settled their differences through strength contests or games. Think of it as a medieval way to avoid a full-scale brawl. You want to argue? Let's see who can toss the hammer farther. It's a theory still debated, but it paints Vikings as a bit more diplomatic and creative than their fearsome reputation suggests. As the sun sets on these Viking games, you can almost hear the laughter, the cheers, the groans of exhaustion, and the clinking of ale mugs. These contests weren't just about brute strength, they were about community, tradition, and a whole lot of fun, even if it meant a few bruised ribs and shattered egos. Next, we'll dive into how Vikings mixed their fierce competitions with humour, turning these serious contests into lively festivals that balanced honour and hilarity in perfect Nordic style. So, you've seen the raw strength, the boulder heaving, and the spirited competitions of the Viking Age. But here's the twist: Vikings didn't just flex muscle for glory and survival. They knew how to blend serious competition with a hefty dose of humour, turning strength contests into raucous, unforgettable parties. You might think a Viking strongman showdown was all grim faces and grunts, but nope. These events were peppered with ridiculous antics, outrageous dares, and more than a few moments that would make a modern-day comedy club proud. Imagine a Viking weightlifting contest that doubles as a comedy show. Participants would not only try to hoist impossibly heavy stones or swing massive hammers, but they'd also crack jokes, make outrageous boasts, and pull pranks on their rivals. One classic example comes from sagas where a challenger, determined to outdo everyone, tries to lift a stone but accidentally lets out a fart so loud it echoes off the fjords, causing everyone to burst into laughter and momentarily forget the competition. Yes, bodily humour was alive and well in Viking society. Historians still argue whether these comedic moments were spontaneous or an essential part of the contests, choreographed to diffuse tension and keep the mood light. But one thing is clear: Vikings understood that strength alone wasn't enough. You had to be a good sport, too. And in a society where physical contests could easily turn violent, humour acted as a social safety valve, preventing things from spiralling out of control. Adding to the hilarity were the so-called mock coronations after the contests. The strongest, or occasionally the luckiest participant, might be crowned king of the feast or king of the table. This temporary title wasn't just a pat on the back. It came with the authority to dole out ridiculous orders for the evening. Think of it as the world's earliest version of King's Cup mixed with medieval improv comedy. The newly crowned king might decree that everyone must drink with their left hand, sing songs backwards, or perform silly tasks like wearing a Viking helmet made of ale barrels. One documented incident involves a guild celebration where the king ordered all participants to toast with their non-dominant hand while reciting the names of saints. The resulting chaos wasn't just amusing, it bonded the group, creating memories and inside jokes that lasted for years. These rituals blurred the line between competition and celebration, reinforcing social ties rather than rivalries. Another quirky tradition involved what modern partygoers would recognise as drinking games, but with a Viking twist. Drink and Dare was a favourite participants could choose to answer embarrassing questions, perform awkward tasks, or take a hefty drinking penalty. One amusing tale recounts a merchant who dared to kiss the tavern keeper's pig while wearing his best hat, resulting in a ruined hat, an angry pig, and a brawl that required town guards to intervene. Yes, Viking parties could get wild. Balance games, like Cross the River, tested participants' coordination and composure under the influence. Contestants had to walk narrow planks over water while carrying full cups of ale. Spilling your drink meant more ale, sometimes a penalty, and sometimes a consolation. Imagine trying to keep your footing while intoxicated and avoiding a splashdown into freezing water, all while your friends cheer or heckle from the sidelines. And let's not forget the infamous Mumble the Peg, a combination of drinking and knife throwing. Players stuck knives into the table while reciting increasingly complex phrases. It was so dangerous that one town banned the game after a string of injuries in a single evening. The combination of sharp objects and alcohol apparently didn't mix well, but it made for spectacular stories, both cautionary and hilarious. These antics highlight an essential truth about Viking society. They valued cleverness and wit alongside strength. Physical prowess was respected, but the ability to entertain, to make others laugh, and to navigate social situations with humour was equally prized. This balance of grit and glee helped maintain social cohesion in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Adding another layer to this is the role of storytelling. After contests, longhouses would echo with tales of the day's events, exaggerated feats, and humorous mishaps. These stories weren't just entertainment, they reinforced community identity and passed down values, blending fact and fiction in a way that historians still debate. Some argue these tales were carefully crafted performances, while others see them as organic expressions of Viking culture. It's also worth noting that Vikings didn't reserve this mix of honour and humour for casual contests. Even religious festivals and royal feasts featured drinking games and competitions where social hierarchies were temporarily upended through laughter and shared challenge. This temporary subversion of norms allowed Vikings to blow off steam and strengthen bonds vital in a society where loyalty and alliance were life and death matters. Now, all this merriment doesn't mean Vikings were reckless party animals. Their contests and celebrations had rules, etiquette, and consequences. Watering down ale or cheating could lead to fines or social penalties, reflecting a community deeply invested in fairness and trust. The humour didn't excuse bad behaviour, it framed competition within a context of mutual respect and shared values. By combining strength challenges with humour and ritual, Vikings created events that were as socially important as they were entertaining. They understood that laughter was as essential as muscle, and that shared joy could forge stronger bonds than fear or intimidation ever could. As we continue, we'll uncover the surprising stories of Viking women who didn't just watch from the sidelines, but actively participated in these strength contests, breaking stereotypes and proving that Viking grit wasn't just a man's game. You might have imagined Viking strength contests as a testosterone-fueled spectacle, starring burly men with axes and bearskins. But hold on to your horned helmets. Viking women were far from mere bystanders. In fact, they were active participants in feats of strength, endurance, and skill, breaking many of the stereotypes that modern culture loves to spin about the Viking Age. Viking women weren't just sitting around spinning wool. Some competed, trained, and displayed physical prowess that would make today's fitness influencers pause mid-Instagram story. First, let's get one thing clear. While the iconic Shield Maiden image has a mythic aura, rooted in some historical basis but heavily romanticised, real Viking women often shouldered immense physical demands in daily life. Managing farms, hauling wood, wrestling unruly livestock, and even defending homesteads during raids called for a baseline toughness and strength that was part of their everyday reality. It's no surprise that some of these women took to competitive physical challenges, not just for glory, but for practical reasons. Archaeological finds, such as the grave of the so-called bad Viking warrior woman discovered in Sweden, have reignited debates about the roles women played, not only in battle but also in social and physical contests. This warrior grave contained weapons and artifacts traditionally associated with men, suggesting that Viking society was more flexible about gender roles than once believed. But beyond the battlefield, women's involvement in strength challenges hints at a vibrant, active female presence in Viking sport and culture. Historical sagas and poetry provide glimpses of women who engaged in wrestling matches, endurance contests, and even stone lifting. Some tales describe women challenging men to feats of strength to prove their worthiness, whether in romantic contexts or as a way to assert social status. Imagine a Viking woman hoisting a heavy stone to impress a suitor or to demonstrate her capability to manage a household or lead a clan. That's not just girl power, that's survival power. Historians still argue how widespread and formalised these women's contests were. Some suggest these events were occasional and informal, while others propose that women's strength competitions had social and ritual significance. Regardless, it's clear these contests were more than just novelty acts. They contributed to community cohesion and reflected values of resilience, skill, and courage shared across genders. One particularly fascinating aspect is the role women played as alewives or brewers in Viking society. Brewing was often a female-dominated craft, requiring physical strength to handle heavy barrels and large kettles. Brewing ale wasn't a gentle pastime. It demanded endurance, precision, and sometimes brute force, lifting sacks of grain, stirring massive vats, and hauling the finished product to market. This work blurred the lines between domestic labour and strength training, giving many women a powerful physical foundation. Alewives also held significant social status. They often ran the local taverns or alehouses, essential community hubs where Vikings gathered to drink, share stories, and organise social events, including those weightlifting contests we've been talking about. So, these women weren't just physically strong, they were influential community figures who helped shape Viking social life. They wielded power not just through muscle, but through social networks, hospitality, and commerce. And, yes, these alewives sometimes competed informally in strength contests, showing off their muscle in the same arenas as men. In fact, some legal records from medieval Scandinavian towns mention disputes involving alewives accused of watering down their brew, suggesting their role was closely regulated and seriously taken. The brewing craft was their business, their livelihood, and their social platform. Outside of brewing, some sagas recount women who joined in wrestling matches or endurance games during festivals. These contests weren't just about physical skill, but also social display. Winning could increase a woman's marriage prospects or elevate her family's status. In one saga, a woman challenges a suitor to a wrestling match. If she wins, she gains a say in marriage arrangements. Spoiler, she wins. These stories may be dramatised, but they reflect underlying cultural acceptance of women's physical agency. There are also records of women participating in stone-carrying challenges, lifting and moving heavy rocks in public contests. While less common than male participation, these events highlighted women's strength and endurance. It's a reminder that Viking society valued practical ability, regardless of gender, especially in the harsh northern environment. One quirky detail is that women's contests sometimes included humorous or theatrical elements. For example, a festival might feature a queen of strength crowned after a playful competition involving carrying firewood or juggling barrels, events that blended strength, balance, and a sense of fun. These playful contests helped ease social tensions, foster community spirit, and celebrate shared resilience. Women also played vital roles as storytellers and keepers of cultural memory around these contests. They passed down tales of heroic strength, mishaps, and triumphs, ensuring that feats of power were remembered and celebrated long after the games ended. These narratives helped create a shared identity rooted in endurance and cleverness. Modern interpretations sometimes underestimate these female roles, but Viking women's participation in strength competitions challenges us to rethink assumptions about gender and power in medieval societies. These women were complex figures who combined physical ability with social savvy, often navigating a world dominated by war and hardship with remarkable skill. Historians still debate the extent of women's involvement, but the evidence points to a culture where strength was admired and cultivated across genders. Viking women weren't just passive spectators, they were active competitors, community leaders, and essential pillars of Viking strength culture. As we move forward, we'll explore the quirky and creative tools of the trade Vikings used in their weightlifting and strength training, revealing a resourceful and sometimes downright amusing approach to fitness in the ancient North. So, you've got a vivid image now of Vikings throwing down in fierce contests, men and women alike showing off muscles that would make today's bodybuilders sweat. But what about the tools they used? Forget sleek barbells or rubber-coated dumbbells. Vikings had their own resourceful, often hilarious, approach to weightlifting gear that's equal parts brutal and brilliant. Their equipment was forged, not in high-tech factories, but in the raw, rugged reality of their environment, proving that sometimes all you need is a big stick, a heavy rock, and a whole lot of determination. Let's start with the basics. Lifting stones, which we've already met, were the Viking gym's cornerstone. These weren't just random rocks tossed around, they were specially chosen for their weight and shape, often smoothed by glaciers or river currents. Some stones had natural handles or indentations, perfect for gripping, while others were awkward lumps that tested not just strength but grip and technique. Imagine trying to deadlift a boulder that keeps slipping through your fingers. No chalk, no straps, just raw Viking grit. But stones weren't the only equipment in play. Logs were a favourite. Vikings would heft massive tree trunks, either to build long ships or as part of strength contests. Rolling, lifting, and carrying heavy logs tested not only muscle power, but endurance and balance. One Viking training exercise involved balancing a log across the shoulders and sprinting, which sounds like an ancient version of today's farmer's carry, except your gym probably doesn't have a forest in the parking lot. And speaking of logs, here's a fun image picture. A group of Vikings competing to lift a log that's obviously too heavy, causing half the team to collapse in a heap while the other half bursts into laughter. Viking training didn't have room for embarrassment. If you fell, you got up. And if you laughed, well, that was part of the workout. Iron weights also played a role, although not in the precise, standardised way we see today. Vikings used lumps of iron or shaped stones weighted with metal as makeshift barbells. Some accounts mention lifting stones with iron handles forged by blacksmiths. But this was a luxury, often reserved for the wealthier warriors or chieftains. The average Viking made do with whatever heavy, awkward objects they could find. One quirky tidbit is the lifting beam. A wooden pole with weights tied at the ends, used to practice lifting and balancing. This simple but effective device helped warriors train for carrying heavy loads over long distances, a skill crucial for moving equipment during raids or battles. Balancing the uneven weights required coordination as much as raw strength, adding a layer of complexity to Viking training. Interestingly, the Vikings didn't just use their training tools for fitness, they doubled as practical implements. The same logs lifted for strength might become ship parts. The iron weights might be repurposed as weapons or tools. This efficient multi-use approach shows a society where survival and sport were deeply intertwined. Historians still debate exactly how organised Viking training was. Some suggest they had informal gyms in communal halls, while others think training was mostly integrated into daily tasks, whether chopping wood, hauling nets, or wrestling by the fire. Vikings constantly built strength through necessity, with occasional bursts of dedicated practice. Here's where Viking creativity shines. They invented games that combined lifting with skill and entertainment. For example, stone toss contests where warriors hurled heavy rocks as far as possible, a primitive but effective way to build explosive power. Unlike today's sanitized shot put, Viking stone tossing could involve tricky terrain, uneven rocks, and a lively crowd heckling the thrower. Another amusing piece of gear was the use of animal bones, or skulls as weights, or props in rituals and contests. These spooky implements added a theatrical flair, inspiring warriors to summon their inner beast. You can almost hear the Vikings joking. If you can lift the dragon's skull, you can lift anything, just watch out for the teeth. Viking diets complemented their physical tools. High-protein meals of fish, meat, and grains fueled their training. And some historians speculate that herbal remedies or potions, more folklore than science, might have been used to boost endurance. Imagine Vikings downing a mysterious brew before lifting stones, half convinced it was Odin's secret strength elixir. Of course, their approach lacked the modern gym's comfort, no padded floors, no music playlists, and definitely no personal trainers shouting. One more rep instead. Training was gritty, communal, and often punctuated by laughter, shouts, and the occasional accidental injury. Vikings embraced this rough and tumble style because it reflected their harsh world. These homemade tools and improvised training methods tell a story of resilience and ingenuity. Vikings didn't need fancy gadgets. They adapted to their environment and turned everyday objects into instruments of power. This creativity in training equipment reflects their broader culture, resourceful, practical, and unafraid to mix hard work with a bit of fun. And speaking of fun, Vikings often spiced up their workouts with competitive games and challenges that tested not just strength but wit and balance. These weren't just solo endeavours, but communal events where skillful lifting, clever tricks, and good humour created unforgettable moments. As we move on, you'll see how the stories of Viking strength, sometimes exaggerated and often tall, have shaped modern perceptions of these fierce northerners, and how historians continue to debate fact from myth in the saga of Viking might. Alright, settle in, because the tales of Viking strength you've heard, they're colossal, like literally larger than life. Imagine hearing about a warrior so strong he could hoist a stone the size of a small car, or carry a bull on his shoulders for a mile. These stories drip with awe, power, and just a splash of did that really happen? And that's where historians today are still scratching their heads, debating what's fact and what's gloriously exaggerated. First off, these Viking strength stories come from sagas, epic narratives told and retold over generations before finally being written down centuries after the Viking Age itself. These sagas were the Netflix binge watch of medieval Scandinavia, packed with heroes, gods, monsters, battles, and of course, insane feats of strength. But like any good drama, the line between truth and fiction got blurrier with every retelling. If you think today's social media exaggerates, imagine relying on oral storytelling, passed from one grizzled Viking to the next after a night of mead-fueled revelry. One saga might tell you about Thorvald, a warrior who lifted a massive stone until his ribs cracked, refusing to put it down until he'd beaten the village record. Another might spin the tale of Gunnar, nicknamed Bull Carrier, who carried a full-grown bull across the field to impress his clan. These stories are thrilling. But let's be honest, carrying a bull, that sounds more like the Viking version of a circus act, or a hold my ale moment gone wildly right. Historians still argue fiercely about the truth behind these tales. Were they recording actual feats? Or were they more like motivational posters for Viking society stories meant to inspire courage, endurance, and reputation building rather than to serve as literal history? Most agree it's a bit of both. Vikings were certainly strong after all. They survived and thrived in harsh environments, demanding tough physiques, but some feats likely became amplified to mythic proportions over time. Digging deeper, archaeological evidence shows Vikings had strong, dense bones and muscles, shaped by a life of hard labour, chopping timber, hauling nets, farming, and fighting. Their bodies were made to endure and to dominate. So while lifting a stone that cracked ribs might sound extreme, these guys were no strangers to moving heavy loads and wrestling wild animals, okay? Maybe not bears, but you get the idea. They weren't just tough for show, they were physically prepared for the brutal demands of their world. Now, here's where things get really interesting and a little funny. Viking sagas don't just record serious strength feats, they mix in humour, absurdity, and even outright silliness. Some tales recount contests where warriors tried to outdo each other with ridiculous challenges, lifting animals, tossing huge stones, or juggling barrels. One story involves a Viking trying to lift a boar by the tusks, only to get a snort and a headbutt for his trouble. The crowd roared, and the tale lived on. These stories served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They reinforced social values, showing that strength came with a sense of humour and resilience. If you couldn't laugh at yourself after falling flat on your face or having a boar charge at you, you weren't Viking material. This blend of grit and good-natured fun kept communities bonded and traditions alive. Moreover, storytelling was a social event. After competitions or long days, Vikings gathered in longhouses to share tales, each version a little taller than the last. A modest stone lift today might become a legendary struggle tomorrow, inspiring awe and laughter in equal measure. This oral tradition was essential for cultural memory and identity, turning everyday feats into heroic legends. Some historians also suggest that these exaggerated strength tales acted as motivational tools. Young warriors aspiring to greatness could look up to these stories, pushing themselves to live up to the Viking ideal of courage and endurance. It was a social contract to tell the tale, build the myth, and inspire the next generation. Of course, strength contests weren't just for show, they had practical roots in training for battle and survival. Wrestling matches, spear throwing, and stone lifting sharpened physical skills and mental toughness necessary for Viking life. But they also provided a controlled way to manage rivalries and conflicts, replacing potential bloodshed with competition, a clever social mechanism. Interestingly, Viking sagas sometimes weave supernatural elements into strength stories, giants with impossible power, gods granting heroic might, magical weapons. These aren't literal history, but cultural metaphors that reveal how Vikings understood strength as more than muscle. It was divine favour, destiny, and identity wrapped in legend. Modern strongman competitions occasionally echo these ancient feats, with athletes lifting stones, inspired by Viking lifting stones or carrying heavy objects. The spirit of Viking strength lives on, reminding us that testing human limits is a timeless pursuit. In the end, Viking strength stories are a rich blend of fact, fiction, humour, and cultural pride. They reveal a society that valued toughness, resilience, and storytelling, a combination that helped Vikings carve their legacy across history. Coming up next, we'll dive into the science behind Viking strength, exploring their diets, training, and even genetics to understand what truly powered these legendary warriors. Alright, now that we've waded through the legendary tales of Viking strength, some of which might have been told after a few too many mugs of mead, it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty. What did Viking strength really look like when we peel back the myth and peek at the science? How did their diet, training habits, and even genetics come together to produce some of the toughest, most resilient warriors history has ever seen? Spoiler alert, it wasn't just about lifting rocks or swinging axes. It was a complex blend of lifestyle, environment, and yes, probably a little bit of Viking grit you can't buy in a gym. First up, diet. Vikings weren't exactly hitting up smoothie bars or ordering kale salads. Their food was hearty, dense, and designed to fuel intense physical activity in harsh climates. Think lots of protein from fish, meat and dairy, combined with robust grains like barley and rye. Archaeological digs have revealed remains of salted or smoked fish, wild game, and even domestic animals like pigs and cattle, alongside grains and vegetables grown in poor soil. This high protein, high energy diet was essential, not just for survival, but for building and maintaining muscle mass, capable of hauling long ships or wielding heavy weapons. Now, while their meals might sound rough compared to today's health food trends, the Vikings were surprisingly savvy about nutrition for their time. Fermented foods like skyr, a type of yogurt, and pickled vegetables were common, offering beneficial probiotics that helped digestion and overall health. They also consumed mead and ale, which, as we've seen, weren't just social lubricants, but also safer than drinking untreated water. Some historians speculate that these fermented drinks might have provided some additional calories and nutrients, acting as an early form of sports drink, minus the electrolytes and fancy packaging. Of course, on the training front, Vikings didn't need gym memberships or personal trainers. Their daily lives were the workout, farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and combat drills all contributed to their fitness. Hauling nets, chopping timber, and lifting heavy stones built functional strength, the kind that translated directly to battlefield effectiveness. Rather than isolated bicep curls, their training was integrated, full body and practical. Wrestling matches and friendly competitions were not only entertainment, but also ways to sharpen reflexes and test endurance. One fascinating aspect is that Vikings likely practiced periodization before the term existed. Their activities changed with the seasons. Spring and summer focused on farming and building, fall on harvesting and preparing for winter, winter on trading, repairing gear and socializing. This natural rhythm kept their bodies active year-round without the risk of burnout. It's a far cry from today's couch-to-gym culture, where seasonal variation is less obvious and often less respected. And here's where genetics might play a part. Recent studies of ancient Scandinavian DNA reveal a population with traits favouring physical robustness, endurance, and metabolic efficiency, likely shaped by centuries of adaptation to cold, harsh environments. These genetic factors would have supported their physically demanding lifestyle. Though, of course, genetics alone don't make a Viking. Lifestyle, culture, and mindset all play crucial roles. Historians still debate how much of Viking strength can be attributed to genetics versus environment and training. It's a classic nature versus nurture discussion, but in the case of Vikings, it's probably a mix of both, with culture amplifying natural physical potential through a lifestyle that demanded resilience. Interestingly, Vikings also valued mental toughness, which is now understood to be critical for peak physical performance. Facing brutal winters, long voyages, and violent conflicts required not just muscle, but grit, focus, and psychological endurance. Their myths and rituals, including strength contests, likely reinforced this mindset, preparing warriors mentally as well as physically. Some fringe historians propose that Vikings might have used herbal remedies or natural stimulants to enhance performance, while there's limited evidence. Certain herbs like juniper, nettle, or bog myrtle were known for medicinal properties and could have been part of health and recovery routines. Whether these acted like modern supplements or simply helped maintain health is still up for debate. And let's not overlook the importance of community in Viking training and fitness. Unlike today's often solitary workouts, Vikings trained and competed in groups. Strength contests, wrestling matches, and games fostered camaraderie and mutual motivation. This social aspect likely boosted performance, encouraging individuals to push their limits and support each other. It's a reminder that fitness is often as much about community as it is about individual effort. Now, here's a quirky detail: some Vikings were known to use rituals involving chanting, songs, or symbolic acts before competitions or battles. Modern sports psychology recognises the power of mental preparation, and it seems Vikings had their own versions of getting in the zone, whether invoking gods, sharing tales of ancestors, or simply psyching themselves up with raucous cheers. All these factors, diet, training, genetics, mindset, and community, paint a picture of Viking strength as a holistic phenomenon. They weren't just strong because they lifted heavy things. They were strong because their whole way of life supported physical excellence. This holistic approach contrasts sharply with some modern fitness trends that isolate muscle groups or emphasize quick fixes. Vikings remind us that true strength comes from integrated living work, play, rest, and ritual, all woven together. As we move on, you'll hear about the fierce rivalries and memorable strength showdowns that made Viking contests legendary, not just tests of muscle, but battles of will, strategy, and sometimes downright ridiculous antics. Picture this: a Viking village buzzing with excitement, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of laughter, shouts, and clinking ale mugs. The day of the great strength showdown, the event that pits neighbour against neighbour, brother against brother, rival clans against each other. This isn't just a friendly competition, it's a fierce battlefield of wills, where muscle meets strategy, pride, and occasionally, downright ridiculousness. These rivalries and rock-throwing showdowns were some of the most memorable and sometimes most absurd moments in Viking society. You see, Viking strength contests weren't just about who could lift the heaviest stone or throw the farthest hammer. They were social events charged with tension, honour, and spectacle. Rivalries could simmer for months, sometimes years, fueled by bragging rights and old grudges. When the day of the contest arrived, it was like a gladiator arena, minus the Colosseum but with plenty of competitive spirit. Some rivalries were between individuals, local heroes trying to prove they were the strongest man or woman in the village. Others were clan-based, where entire families or tribes sought to outshine each other, solidifying status and influence. The stakes, respect, alliances, and sometimes the right to marry into a powerful family or claim land. Winning a contest could change your social standing overnight. Losing meant bruised pride and, in some cases, a fair bit of teasing. One famous tale tells of two rival Viking chieftains who decided to settle their feud with a stone-carrying contest. The stones were massive, so heavy that few dared even approach them. The contest drew a huge crowd, with bets placed and voices raised in encouragement. But here's the twist during the competition. One chieftain's stone slipped, sending him tumbling into the mud. The crowd erupted in laughter, and while he lost the contest, his good humour in defeat earned him respect. This story reminds us that, alongside strength, Vikings valued honour, humility, and the ability to take a fall gracefully. Rock-throwing contests were another highlight and sometimes a source of hilarity. Imagine a group of Vikings lining up to toss jagged boulders as far as possible, some soaring impressively, others bouncing off trees or veering wildly off course. One tale humorously recounts a warrior whose rock, instead of flying forward, landed on his own foot, causing a comedic uproar and a few choice insults from the crowd. Such mishaps didn't diminish the fun. They added colour to the event and created stories told around fires for generations. The physical demands of these contests were enormous, but Vikings also had to be clever strategists. Strength alone wasn't enough. Understanding balance, leverage, and timing could make the difference between victory and humiliation. For example, when lifting stones, knowing how to shift your weight and use your legs effectively was crucial. A brute force approach might result in a muscle pull or dropped stone, while technique could impress judges and spectators alike. These rivalries and contests were often accompanied by ceremonial pomp. Winners were celebrated with feasts, gifts, and sometimes honorary titles like Strongest in the North. Temporary titles granted power during festivals, letting victors order dares, assign drinking penalties, or lead communal dances. This mix of competition and celebration made Viking strength contests vibrant social affairs, blending seriousness with merriment. But it wasn't all friendly fun. Sometimes, rivalries flared into outright brawls. Tavern fights after a night of heavy drinking could erupt into melees, sparked by lingering contest grudges or insults. Yet, even these conflicts had a code. Serious bloodshed was usually avoided, as Vikings understood that community strength depended on cohesion. Many disputes were resolved through formal duels or rematches, keeping rivalry within socially acceptable bounds. Here's a quirky note. Some Viking contests included unusual penalty challenges for those who failed spectacularly. One such penalty was the infamous kiss the pig. where the loser had to publicly smooch a local farm animal while wearing a ridiculous hat. This tradition, part punishment and part entertainment, guaranteed laughter and kept tensions from boiling over. And yes, there are records of merchants who bravely accepted the dare, only to emerge with a ruined hat and a legendary story. These showdowns also had psychological warfare elements. Competitors might trash talk, exaggerate feats, or use intimidation tactics. A strongman might boast of lifting impossible weights or surviving brutal battles to unsettle rivals. This bravado, combined with humour, created a lively atmosphere where physical might met mental sharpness. Historians still debate how formalised these rivalries and contests were. Some suggest they were spontaneous community events, while others argue for organised festivals with rules and judges. Archaeological finds of large gathering spaces and ceremonial stones support the idea that these contests were major social fixtures, integral to Viking life. In the thick of these rivalries, social dynamics played out in fascinating ways. A successful competitor might gain allies, forge political ties, or secure trade advantages. Conversely, failure could lead to social isolation or diminished influence. This high-stakes environment underscored the importance Vikings placed on physical prowess as a currency of power. And it wasn't just men getting in on the action. Women participated in some contests, often to challenge suitors or assert their own strength within the community. Their involvement added another layer to the social fabric, showing that strength and rivalry transcended gender lines. Behind the spectacle lay a society deeply attuned to the balance between competition and community. Rivalries pushed individuals to excel, but communal celebrations ensured that strength contests reinforced social bonds rather than tearing them apart. As we shift from these fierce showdowns, get ready to explore how these contests fit into larger Viking social events, feasts, festivals, and celebrations where muscles flexed alongside laughter, songs, and perhaps a few regrettable dance moves as the dust settles from the fierce rivalries and rock-throwing showdowns. Imagine the Vikings shifting gears from competition to celebration, a seamless transition from battle to banquet. In Viking society, strength contests weren't isolated spectacles, but vital threads woven into the rich tapestry of social life. Feasts, fights, and flexing muscles all blended into grand occasions where power, pride, and party spirit collided in ways that would make even the rowdiest modern-day festival look tame. Viking feasts were legendary for their scale, exuberance, and duration. Unlike the quick dinners many of us are accustomed to, these banquets could last for days, filled with food, drink, music, storytelling, and, yes, plenty of drinking contests and weightlifting challenges. Feasts weren't just about sustenance, they were social and political theatre, where alliances were forged, disputes settled, and reputations made or broken. And at the heart of this theatre was the display of strength. You see, in a world where physical power could decide everything, from land disputes to leadership roles, demonstrating your muscle at a feast was more than vanity, it was a statement. Imagine a longhouse packed with hundreds of guests, the air thick with smoke and the scent of roasting boar. Warriors and villagers alike gathered to witness feats of strength, from stone lifting to hammer throwing, alongside toasts and raucous singing. These contests during a feast served multiple purposes. They honoured the gods and ancestors, entertained the crowd, and reinforced social hierarchies. The strongest competitors were celebrated with toasts in their honour, gifted with prized mead horns or weapons, and given prominent seating near the chieftain's table. This public recognition was a powerful currency in Viking culture, where respect often translated to influence and survival. But Viking feasts weren't all solemn displays of might. Humour and chaos had starring roles. Drinking contests spiralled into laughter-filled competitions, where participants attempted ridiculous feats, lifting stones while balancing on one leg or singing bawdy songs between sips. Games like King of the Table crowned a temporary monarch of the revelry, granting them the right to assign silly drinking penalties or dictate the next challenge. These moments blurred the line between competition and carnival, reminding everyone that Vikings knew how to party hard and laugh even harder. And then there were the fights, the brawls that inevitably erupted once ale flowed freely. While not the goal of feasts, these scuffles were part of the social fabric. They often stemmed from old rivalries or disputes ignited by spirited boasting. Yet, even in conflict, Vikings followed a code, avoiding serious injuries when possible to keep the community intact. Many disputes were resolved through duels or by the chieftain's intervention, blending violence with diplomacy. Beyond the longhouse, feasts also marked crucial moments in the agricultural calendar. Harvest celebrations, for example, were not only about giving thanks for the year's bounty, but also about communal bonding and, naturally, strength contests. After weeks of back-breaking labour, villagers gathered to compete in lifting and carrying challenges, celebrating both the fruits of their toil and their physical endurance. One Sussex manor recorded providing each harvester with 2 gallons of strong ale for the harvest feast, a generous ration signalling the importance of alcohol in marking success and sustaining community morale. Stronger ale and wine flowed during these occasions, reflecting the shift from daily sustenance to indulgence and celebration. Religious festivals similarly intertwined with drinking and contests. The Feast of St. Martin in November marked the completion of the wine harvest, celebrated with ritual barrel openings, blessings, and ample drinking. Some monasteries brewed special ales for Easter, infused with herbs symbolising Christ's resurrection, highlighting how sacred and social drinking blended seamlessly. Even noble feasts elevated drinking to an art form. At a 1376 Christmas feast hosted by a king, nearly 48,000 gallons of wine were consumed over 12 days, with designated pourers ensuring cups were never empty. Guests were expected to maintain composure while consuming vast quantities, a valued skill that showcased stamina and self-control. Archaeological digs reveal elaborate drainage systems beneath high tables, allowing nobles to relieve themselves without leaving the feast, a practice both practical and, frankly, a bit gross by modern standards. Children weren't excluded either. Weaker children's ales were common, fermented just enough to kill bacteria but with minimal alcohol. Medieval medical guides recommended watered-down wine or weak ale for kids over 7, a notion that would raise eyebrows today, but made sense in a world where water was often deadly. These all-day drinking cultures structured daily life. Breakfast often began with a pint of small beer, followed by more ale at midday and stronger evening brews. Drinking was functional, hydrating and nourishing, while also fueling social interaction. Work and play intertwined, with harvesters receiving extra ale to prevent dehydration during grueling summer days. Taverns, ale houses, and beer halls were the social hubs where this culture thrived. Far from mere watering holes, these establishments hosted guild meetings, business transactions, and legal proceedings. In York, a single tavern in 1396 hosted guild elections, property deals, marriage negotiations, and small claims court all before dinner. The ale served wasn't incidental, but central to these events, creating an atmosphere conducive to agreement and camaraderie. Guilds formalised drinking's social role through ritualised toasting sequences, reinforcing hierarchy and bonding members. Apprentices often found mastering drinking customs as challenging as their crafts. Drinking culture also provided a foundation for later institutions, like insurance schemes, originating from mutual support networks forged over shared cups. Religious institutions actively participated, brewing some of the largest quantities of ale in medieval Europe. Monasteries like Burton-on-Trent produced over 1 million gallons annually by the 15th century, both for internal use and commercial sale. Religious pilgrimages incorporated tavern stops as central social components, where people from varied backgrounds mingled, shared stories, and forged connections. While all this revelry brought joy, it wasn't without darker sides brawls. Public drunkenness and hangovers were common. Communities developed laws and systems to manage alcohol's harms, balancing enjoyment with safety. Through all these layers, Viking drinking culture revealed a society that embraced strength, celebration, community, and humour in equal measure. Feasts and contests weren't just about indulgence, but about weaving social fabric and sustaining collective identity. Coming up next, we'll explore how the legacy of Viking strength and drinking traditions echoes into modern times, from strongman competitions to pub games and festivals that continue to celebrate the spirit of those ancient warriors. Alright, let's really dive deep now, because the legacy of Viking strength and their boisterous drinking traditions is far from a dusty footnote in history. It's a living, breathing influence that pulses through many facets of modern culture, from the thunderous arenas of today's strongman competitions to the lively backyard battlegrounds of pub games, and all the way to cinematic epics and cultural festivals. The spirit of Viking Weightlifting Showdowns continues to flex its muscle across centuries. What follows is an exploration, long and winding, of how these ancient feats of power have evolved, morphed, and embedded themselves into the fabric of contemporary life, often in ways you'd never expect. Let's kick off with strongman competitions, those grand modern-day spectacles where titans of strength hoist massive stones, flip enormous tyres, and drag trucks like they're carrying groceries. Here, the echoes of Viking lifting stones resonate loud and clear. The iconic Atlas Stones event is a direct homage to those ancient monoliths Vikings hoisted in contest. Picture competitors straining to lift spherical stones weighing between 300 to 400 pounds, heaving them onto platforms of varying heights. This event is the spiritual successor to the age-old Viking challenge of moving heavy boulders, where technique was as crucial as raw power. The audience roars, just like they might have in the smoky halls of a longhouse centuries ago. But it's not just the physical feats. The culture surrounding these competitions is reminiscent of Viking camaraderie and rivalry. Strong men often banter, joke, and celebrate each other's accomplishments, blending competition with mutual respect, a social dynamic that likely played out around Viking stone lifting contests. The idea of strength as a shared language, a currency to build friendships and social standing, is very much alive in these modern arenas. Next, think about the world of pub games. The lawn game. Cub has skyrocketed in popularity worldwide, and it's often called Viking chess for good reason. Its roots stretch back to Scandinavian history, where villagers would engage in friendly battles of precision and strategy. knocking wooden blocks down with batons. The simplicity and accessibility of Cub Mirror, Viking values, physical skill, married to social engagement. No fancy equipment needed. This game fosters social bonds and light-hearted competition, much like the communal contests of strength and skill in Viking villages. Speaking of pubs, consider the social role of drinking establishments today. Modern pubs remain vital community hubs, places where people gather to share stories, debate, and yes, engage in a fair amount of spirited rivalry, whether it's darts, arm wrestling, or impromptu drinking challenges. These spaces continue the tradition of combining strength and social interaction. The informal king of the table, or master of ceremonies titles, often bestowed during nights of revelry, echo the Viking practice of crowning temporary monarchs to rule the festivities with humour and authority. Now, festivals celebrating Viking heritage serve as vibrant reminders of the past. Reenactments of stone lifting, wrestling, and weapon throwing bring history to life, allowing participants to step into the boots of their ancestors. These events are more than performances. They're immersive experiences where physicality and tradition collide. The careful reconstruction of Viking lifting stones and the demonstration of ancient techniques create a tangible connection to a world where strength was a key to survival and respect. Pop culture plays a significant role in keeping the Viking mythos alive. 2. From blockbuster films to TV series and video games, Vikings are often portrayed as muscular, fearless warriors engaged in epic battles and feats of strength. While Hollywood occasionally stretches the truth, hello, those horned helmets, the core image of Vikings as embodiments of power and endurance, resonates globally. This portrayal, sometimes exaggerated, nonetheless feeds public fascination and keeps Viking strength stories circulating. Language itself bears traces of this legacy. Phrases like strong as a Viking or Viking spirit, pepper marketing slogans, sports commentary, and everyday conversation. These idioms invoke toughness, resilience, and indomitable will qualities associated with Vikings and their legendary strength contests. This linguistic heritage keeps Viking ideals alive in subtle but powerful ways. Even fitness trends today nod to the Viking ethos. Functional training, strongman workouts, and natural movement emphasize whole body strength and practical skills lifting. Carrying, throwing that align with how Vikings built muscle through daily life and training. Exercises like the farmer's carry, tire flips, and stone lifts have clear parallels in Viking practices, highlighting an enduring appreciation for strength grounded in utility. But Viking strength culture was about more than muscle. It was about balance, humour, social connection, ritual, and respect all played vital roles. The playful drinking games, communal celebrations, and mock coronations that accompanied contests remind us that Vikings knew strength wasn't just physical, it was social and psychological too. This holistic view of strength continues to inspire. People today seek not just to build muscle, but to connect with traditions that celebrate resilience and community. Viking stories provide a potent narrative framework for this quest, blending history, myth, and personal challenge. Looking forward, we'll dive into the lingering mysteries surrounding Viking strength contests, the debates, the unanswered questions, and the fascinating puzzles that historians and archaeologists continue to unravel. What did Vikings truly value? How much of their strength culture was ritual, sport, or survival? These questions keep the Viking saga alive and evolving. In the meantime, The spirit of those ancient strongmen lives on in the grip of a lifting stone, the cheers of a crowd, and the shared joy of pushing human limits. As we approach the twilight of our journey through the thunderous echoes of Viking Weightlifting Showdowns, it's time to confront the shadows, the mysteries, debates, and tantalizing questions that continue to swirl around these legendary feats. Viking strength contests were undeniably vital to their society, but what exactly did they mean? How much do we truly know? And what remains forever obscured by the fog of time? Myth and limited evidence. The truth is, historians still puzzle over many aspects, and that's part of what makes exploring Viking strength culture endlessly fascinating. First off, one of the biggest challenges historians face is separating fact from fiction. Much of our knowledge comes from sagas and chronicles written centuries after the Viking Age. These sources mix history, legend, and artistic license in ways that make it difficult to pin down exact realities. When a saga recounts a warrior lifting a stone so massive it splits the earth, we have to wonder, was this a literal event, symbolic storytelling, or a tall tale designed to inspire awe and convey cultural values? Scholars remain divided, with some arguing for a metaphorical interpretation and others looking for archaeological corroboration. Archaeological evidence, while invaluable, is frustratingly incomplete. Lifting stones and other strength-related artifacts survive in some regions, but are scarce elsewhere. Some stones, like the Husafell stone in Iceland, are famed and well documented, but it's unclear how representative they were across Viking lands. Were these contests widespread or limited to specific areas and social groups? Historians debate whether lifting stones were primarily ritual objects, practical training tools, or status symbols. The truth may lie in a complex mix of all three. Another mystery surrounds the social dynamics of these contests. While we know they were important for establishing status and forging alliances, how inclusive were they? Did all community members participate, or were strength contests primarily male-dominated elite events? There is growing evidence that Viking women took part in strength challenges, but the extent and nature of their involvement remain open questions. Gender roles in Viking society were complex, and strength culture likely reflected this nuance. The role of ritual and religion also puzzles scholars. Many sagas hint at religious significance tied to strength feats, lifting stones to honour gods, or strength contests linked to seasonal festivals. Were these contests spiritual acts, expressions of devotion, or simply social entertainment with ritual overtones? Some argue that the blurring of sacred and secular was typical in Viking culture, making it difficult to separate the two cleanly. Strength was a gift from the gods and a tool for survival, and contests may have served multiple overlapping purposes. Historians also question how Viking strength contests evolved over time. The Viking Age spanned roughly 3 centuries, a period of rapid cultural, political, and technological change. Did contests remain consistent throughout, or did they adapt to shifting social structures, trade influences, and interactions with other cultures? The gradual introduction of commercial brewing and guild systems, for example, likely influenced drinking culture and associated social practices. Strength contests might have similarly transformed, moving from informal village events to more organised guild activities. The influence of external cultures complicates the picture further. Vikings were traders, raiders, and settlers interacting with Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and later European societies. Did these interactions shape Viking strength traditions? Evidence of similar stone lifting and wrestling contests in other cultures suggests cross-cultural exchange or parallel development. Understanding these dynamics requires a broader lens, situating Viking contests within the medieval European context. Even the biomechanics and training methods used by Vikings remain largely speculative, while modern reconstructions attempt to recreate lifting stones and training regimens. Precise knowledge is lacking. Did Vikings use systematic training plans or rely on daily labour and seasonal cycles? How did they recover from injuries or maintain peak condition without modern medicine? Some insights come from monastic records and medical texts hinting at folk remedies and herbal treatments. But much is conjecture. The balance Vikings struck between competition, celebration, and social regulation also intrigues historians. Alcohol-fueled contests could lead to violence, yet communities developed laws and customs to manage excess and maintain order. How formalized were these regulations? To what extent did they reflect community values versus top-down authority? The evolution of public intoxication laws and guild sanctions suggests a sophisticated social approach to managing the risks of revelry. Moreover, the psychological dimensions of Viking strength, culture, how mental toughness, humour, and social bonds intersected with physical prowess are ripe for exploration. Sagas hint at the importance of wit, resilience, and camaraderie in contests, suggesting a holistic understanding of strength beyond muscle. Modern sports psychology resonates with these ideas, emphasizing mindset as key to performance and social harmony. Finally, many fascinating questions remain about the everyday experiences of ordinary Vikings, while chieftains and legendary heroes dominate the sagas. What about farmers, craftsmen, and women who also engaged in strength contests? How did these traditions shape their lives and identities? Oral histories and archaeological findings provide glimpses, but a comprehensive picture is elusive. Despite these uncertainties, the enduring fascination with Viking strength contests speaks to their powerful cultural legacy. They embody human themes of challenge, community, and celebration that transcend time. As historians continue to uncover clues and debate interpretations, our understanding deepens and evolves. So, as we close this chapter, remember that Viking strength culture is a living puzzle, a blend of history, myth, and mystery, inviting us to explore not just the past, but the timeless spirit of human resilience and camaraderie. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the day winds down, imagine yourself in a smoky longhouse, the warmth of the fire, the murmur of voices sharing tales, the faint clink of a stone being lifted once more, not just a test of muscle, but a celebration of life itself.